It's my nerd world, and welcome to it, a Star Wars podcast. Listener feedback for the week of February 28th. I hope you had a fantastic month. I am your host, Jon Justice. We have a lot of great emails and comments from YouTube to get to this week. A lot of individuals talking about some of the more controversial topics and comments made on last week's show. And we're going to wrap up with this fantastic email that I received from one of the listeners of listener feedback, getting into the end of the Rise of Skywalker, which you're definitely not going to want to miss. Let's not waste any more time and get right to listener feedback this week, brought to you by the science fiction space opera series written by Jon Justice. Hey, that's me. EMBARK, available now at Amazon.com. More details about that later on in the show.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you.
My nerd world.
Just let it in.
You can always email TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Again, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Or leave a comment up on YouTube if that is where you are listening to the show. And welcome to My Nerd World, a Star Wars podcast. Listener feedback for, again, this week of February 28th. Bit of a preview for those that have listened to the show but are wondering what's going on. Why is there a listener feedback show? Just as a brief update, the weekly show here on My Nerd World has been split into two shows. One focused strictly on your comments for listener feedback. And then the main show coming up later on this weekend, where we get into some of the news and more commentary. This week on the main show, lots to get to. Bob Iger in a, what came as a surprising move for a lot of people ahead of the end of his contract agreement in December of 2021, has stepped down as a CEO of Disney. Bob Padchek, is that his name? Another Bob is taking over. We'll talk about that on the main show this week. Also, Lucasfilm announced the big publishing endeavor, which had gone under the name of Project Luminous for a long time. It's now the High Republic. I will give you my deep thoughts on the High Republic and my level of excitement for this publication event, this publication effort that they're doing, and what it could possibly mean for future films. So a couple of topics that we'll be covering again on the main show this week. But let's get right into your listener feedback for this week. There's a lot of great comments. A lot of you took time to write extensively, and I want to make sure everybody gets their due time. So we'll start off with Mr. Maz, who says this. Anybody who thinks a company like Lucasfilm, Disney, would be swayed by a loud minority of haters on social media really aren't thinking clearly. These films have a team of story talent behind them. They know how to parse out internet noise and put it into perspective. Totally agree. Rey is a Palpatine because JJ probably always wanted her to be. That's it. As for this, Disney should have planned the sequel trilogy better like the original trilogy and prequel narrative. Sorry, this doesn't fly in my opinion. Before we move on, I want to make a quick comment about something. I went back and I didn't watch the whole thing. I was getting ready to go to bed and had some time to kill and wanted to watch something Star Wars. So I brought up The Force Awakens on my iPad and watched the end confrontation between Rey and Kylo and Finn and Kylo, and then the end battle. And this was one of the first times I think I had watched The Force Awakens since The Rise of Skywalker, because I had been watching The Rise of Skywalker so many times. 15 was my total count for seeing it in the theater. But it's interesting now knowing she's a Palpatine, and then the way that she taps into the Force, that being Rey, at the end of The Force Awakens, and the level of intensity that she has against Kylo Ren. I'm going to be honest, knowing that she's a Palpatine now really adds some cool depth to that particular scene, because now you can look at her and go, regardless of whether or not it was the director's intention, you watch that scene and you can see the intensity of Palpatine and a level of anger in her counterattack to Kylo Ren. Mr. Moss continues, this will get some hate, but this notion is due to a post-MCU world, Marvel Cinematic Universe, where every franchise film needs to hint at and build to and reference the next one. There's so much to unpack here. The MCU isn't nearly as planned out as fans think. Disney is just good at pretending that it is. They make it up as they go along. There are dozens of dropped and truncated stories and characters and arcs in the MCU because it's the most popular franchise in the world at the moment. These points never get mentioned. The MCU, from a business and production standpoint, changed the game in Hollywood. Because of its insane process, people start to judge every other big budget franchise against it. I totally agree with you, Mr. Moz. Sorry, that's not how it works. And it's a myth that Lucas had the original trilogy planned out in some grand plan. I hate to sound gatekeepy, but if you look up just a fragment of the history of the making of the original trilogy, you will learn just how much these films have changed during development. Again, that's absolutely correct, and I've watched as much of the making of Star Wars as I can, and Mr. Moss is 100% correct. You know, Lucas had, I think, a basic outline, and we've talked about that before, he had one story, which was the original trilogy, and then knew he couldn't get all of it made because it was just too big of an endeavor. So he took the first third of that 3-arc story that was the original trilogy and made it A New Hope. But he had to build upon that to go and create The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And I know, again, from my own personal world building, writing my EMBARK science fiction series, it was very much the same way. I knew exactly what that first book was going to be, kind of self-contained. And then I just kind of had a rough idea of what the next 2 books in the trilogy would be, The Treasure in Darkness and then The Vanishing War, which comes out in April. So it's provided me a really unique perspective just from a content creator standpoint of kind of how this process works mentally. A New Hope went through at least a half a dozen drafts. The initial idea Lucas drafted is totally unrecognizable from what we actually got. Lucas hired different writers to finish off the trilogy, for crying out loud. If the original trilogy was the master plan like fans think it is, then why did he go and hand off The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi to different writers and directors? Empire retcons A New Hope, and are we really going to pretend that the Leia reveal in Return of the Jedi was well executed, right? Return of the Jedi is my favorite Star Wars film, writes Mr. Moz, but I can look at it fairly and see plenty of issues, right? The Leia twist is so flat and forced in the film, yet because canon ran with it in the intervening years and the original trilogy became this god-tier thing, the flaws you can pick apart in the original trilogy aren't treated as a big deal. Yep, totally agree. I feel like I wrote this. We all just accept it because that's the lore, right? And the original trilogy has this untouchable shield around it within the fandom. We don't care about inconsistencies in the OT because it's the OT. It's a legacy in and of itself. Yeah, the prequel trilogy is the most unified trilogy of the saga in its look and its tone because Lucas was in charge from the beginning. Yep. But sorry, as much as some fans have embraced the prequel over the years, I don't think it's controversial to say it's still considered by most to be the weakest of the saga films. No, and I absolutely agree. I probably like the prequel films as a whole more than I like Return of the Jedi, right? Return of the Jedi has fantastic moments, but as I've mentioned before, the Jabba's Palace opening of the movie and then even the Endor stuff just doesn't, it's just not as entertaining for me. But I do agree. If you take all 3 trilogies and if you were forced to have to go and rank what's the most, which ones are the best ones, the prequels are going to be on the bottom. I think there's arguments to be made now, and we can get into that later on about comparisons of the sequel trilogy and the original trilogy and a lot of the different nuances that separates them as well. But let's get back to Mr. Maz. So the prequel trilogy, having a plan, really didn't help it because Lucas wasn't challenged on his ideas. So no, the sequel trilogy didn't need more planning. It was planned out as much as any big budget franchise film is. People need to stop letting their disappointment get in the way of the reality. Not liking a story doesn't mean it wasn't planned. Do people honestly think Kathleen Kennedy, the most powerful producer in Hollywood, and the creators at Lucasfilm, just said screw it and half-assed the making of the sequel trilogy after Disney spent billions on it? Really? Come on, get back to reality. Yeah, and again, and I don't want to keep belaboring the point because Mr. Maz made some great points, but that really is what it feels like, right? And to the power of that sort of narrative that was out there, I mentioned last week that when I saw the listing on the Blu-ray for The Rise of Skywalker of what the content was going to be, I was reminded, oh yeah, this was a major production. Look, I knew that all along, but so many random anonymous voices out in the ether and out on Twitter and YouTube had perpetuated this idea that The Rise of Skywalker was this slapped-together film that on a subconscious level it kind of seeped in to where you see some of the documentary details, or you hear from one of the, the producers, Rick Carter, which we talked about on the main show last week, talk about the level of planning that went into making The Rise of Skywalker, and you go, oh yeah, they were really on top of their game. All right, let's get back to the emails and friend of the show, Jen G. It seems Disney is doing a lot of second-guessing themselves. It's a movie, no a TV show, maybe now a movie, no a TV show, but pushed back. I think every detail of a movie doesn't need to be explained or followed through. How is that fun? Let me stop here real quick. I don't know how much of this is... I don't disagree with what Gen G is saying, but I want to add that, these are all the things we're hearing. And the back and forth, if it's a movie, it's a TV show, when you're looking at the reports that have come out about the Obi-Wan live-action TV show and the delays that have been made, it's hard to sort of work through, what's pop culture fake news and what's real fake news. And I've said this all along. I wish that we didn't have this level of behind-the-scenes gossip that goes around with these films. It's just, it doesn't. I don't think it helps with the fandom. It doesn't help when it comes to having fun speculation, and we end up with this back and forth and filling in the gaps of the information we don't have off of information that we don't even know is legitimate. Let's get back to Gen G's email. I'm not much of a details person, so I don't tend to focus on minor things. I guess that's why it doesn't get to me when someone doesn't get an explanation. As for the Rise of Skywalker behind the scenes on the release of the Blu-ray and digital, it sounded kind of meh to me. As usual, I will wait to see it. I will want to see it. I always have hope they put more behind the scenes of the lightsaber battles, and they never really do, or to the extent that I want. I would love it if they got more in-depth into the battle between Ben and the Knights of Ren, or just about the Knights of Ren, or anything about Kylo Ben, period. Maybe I'm just ill this afternoon when you gave that extras list that it didn't get me excited. They always seem to do an extra on the creatures, do different for once. I don't remember anybody saying, ooh, Dio was so great. I need to know more, which is a side note. I did love Dio. I love Dio too. So highlighting Dio in the extras seems strange. I feel like this behind-the-scenes / extra stuff sounds like Disney is saying, we're going to keep this as a generic vanilla vibe here. But again, I just got up from a long nap and I'm a bit cranky. And to be fair, I haven't seen The Rise of Skywalker in full since December 19th, so I probably need a refresher. By the way, when will the digital and Blu-ray come out? I am excited to see it again as many times as I want, ending this on a positive tip. Great podcast. So the digital release comes out on the 17th of the month, and then on March 17th, and then the physical release lands in stores on the 31st, and then there's talk that it'll probably end up on the Disney streaming service sometime, probably around the summertime. I would imagine probably around when Star Wars Celebration takes place. All right, friend of the show Everson says this. According to outside material, Luke's lightsaber is in the hands of the caretakers on Ahch-To. This is going back to the conversation, and I think it was Brian Martin's question about where was Luke's green lightsaber. Thank you, Everson, as always. Brian Martin, speaking of the individual who asked that question, has a couple of questions this week. Friend of the show. How can we be absolutely sure that after the Rise of Skywalker ending, Palpatine will stay dead this time? We can't. I mean, at the moment, we assume he's dead. we assumed he was dead at the end of Return of the Jedi. There's, Disney and Lucasfilm could 10 years down the line bring back Palpatine, so there's no assurances of that. I'm assuming he's dead for good. I'm assuming that Disney and Lucasfilm, when they say the Skywalker saga is over, are telling the truth, but at the same time, I believe that's only temporary, and sometime down the line, that Skywalker-esque Episode 10 will pop up. What do you think it is about The Mandalorian that is bringing fans more closely together than the prequel trilogy and the sequel trilogy ever have? That's an interesting one, because I think you have to start with, is The Mandalorian really bringing fans more closely together than the prequel trilogy and the Star Wars trilogy? And I say that because that is the perception. The perception is The Mandalorian is bridging the gap with fans in a very controversial time in the fandom. Why do we have that perception? We have that perception because of what we see out in public. What are we looking at out in public? We're looking at Twitter. We're looking at YouTube videos. Some commentary with friends, because I think that The Mandalorian bridged the gap for a lot of people who are casual fans and brought casual fans to the table. So I'm first going to say that I'm not 100% sure as a whole, if we're talking sheer numbers of people, that The Mandalorian has done anything major about bringing fans closer together than the prequel trilogy or the sequel trilogy did. I just think that the positive narrative in the public is more prevalent than there was certainly in the prequel trilogy, pre-Twitter, right, social networking, and the sequel trilogy. I would say that en masse you have more fans that have come together, even with the controversy, with the prequels and the sequels, just in terms of sheer numbers. Okay, so let's get back to your question and look at it from the angle of, within the public, the narrative seems to be The Mandalorian is bringing fans more closely together. The reason, in my opinion, that's the narrative is because The Mandalorian, and nobody has said this, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I'm just saying it's a thing. The Mandalorian played it safe. The Mandalorian took what makes A New Hope great, which is a level of simplicity in the middle of a large galaxy with deep mythology. So The Mandalorian isn't really that controversial. You get these half-hour to 40-minute bites of the story of The Mandalorian. It's very limited in scope, with limited characters, right? Set in a great big. It's a smaller, tighter story, so it doesn't invite the level of controversy and criticism that you see most often, especially when it comes to the sequel trilogy. We're not looking at a level of mythology that has a lot of baggage attached to it already. Some people know about the Mandalorian culture, but the majority of the casual fans, haven't watched the Clone Wars and haven't watched any of those Mandalorian arcs. So I think the fans were eager to get on board and back something. The Mandalorian was something that everybody could love equally. Plus, it has this amazing, the child in it, which I think did a lot. Because I think if you change that character and it's not nearly as popular as the child is, then the popularity of the Mandalorian doesn't end up transcending beyond the a little bit more than casual fan and the hardcore fan. So, again, I think The Mandalorian is a great show that does Star Wars to its essence and doesn't take a lot of risks. And therefore, a lot of people are really digging it. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. Don't misunderstand. But I think that's the reason why. Why did they bother giving Maz a line of dialogue saying that the explanation for how she had Anakin's lightsaber was a story for another time, if they weren't going to explain it at any point in the sequel trilogy itself? It's a setup with no payoff. My take on that was, JJ, and I think JJ has shown this now in both of his movies, certainly more so in The Rise of Skywalker, where JJ will introduce things and just do a kind of go with it. Palpatine's back. I can cheat death. It's a pathway to the ability that many people believe is unnatural. That was enough for most people. It was enough for me to explain why Palpatine was back. I imagine that JJ didn't want to waste a lot of time getting into the backstory of Anakin's lightsaber. It's now being told in ancillary material. One of the comic books that came out recently, the final frame shows a hooded individual that people think is a female in Cloud City holding up Anakin's Legacy lightsaber. So, the reason why there was no payoff in the movies is because JJ needed to bring Anakin's lightsaber back. He wanted to attach it to Maz, but basically did a great story for another time and then moved on and let the audience go and decide, okay, you can either accept that or not accept it, and then we can tell that story in some kind of ancillary material. And as I've said before, that's the ambiguity that Star Wars is allowed to get away with, in my opinion, because they do a lot of that ambiguous storytelling technique. So the payoff is coming in ancillary material. You could say the same thing about C-3PO with his red arm in The Force Awakens, to which, JJ said, okay, well, I wanted C-3PO to look different to sort of indicate this was a different era. So I gave him a red arm. I replaced it and gave him back his gold arm at the end of the movie. And you'll find out in a comic book why he got the red arm, and we did. Thank you, as always, Brian Martin. Appreciate your emails. All right, Miranda writes, don't ever let anybody bully you and tell you how to do your fandom or how you do Star Wars wrong. Nobody is in a position to tell anyone their views on Star Wars is completely wrong, and theirs is more superior. I agree, Miranda. Thank you. What is it with this continued ongoing cognitive dissonance in our society today, particularly when it comes to critiquing the dumbest of the dumbest reasons to nitpick in entertainment, especially when it's directed at one of the most important franchises of our time and culture? Why the dickens should anyone care what can or cannot happen or occur in a space fantasy movie? What a shame for some people to not allow their imagination to give them an interpretation or an idea of what a story is trying to tell them and what is going on. And an even bigger shame, Miranda goes on to say, is that we continue to have people out there when it comes to our fandom, and they think that their point of view is the best and they want to act like the smartest person in the room. Such arrogance, and then they feel they have the authority and be in a position to bully and feel right about trying to make you feel dumb and anyone feeling dumb. Yeah, it's weird, man. I had an exchange the other day on the at the My Nerd World account on Twitter with somebody. I forgot how it started. Somebody was commenting on. Somebody had written a lengthy article about Ben Solo and the problem that they had in the Star Wars movies when it comes to redemption and it having to equal death. And so I commented on, because it was an article and they were asking for suggestions. So I commented on it, and I had somebody who got all bent because I liked the ending of the Rise of Skywalker. And it was just, again, one of those exchanges where you go, why don't act like all those people that were idiots about The Last Jedi, please. But we're so far beyond that now, it doesn't matter. Thank you, as always, for the comment there, Miranda. I appreciate it. All right, friend of the show, Shlomo, says this. So while I haven't contributed 10% of the $1.1 billion to the box office of The Rise of Skywalker, I have seen it enough that I think I figured out the entire Palpatine arc. Bottom line is, Palpatine has never left Exegol. At least not for hundreds of years. The Last Jedi showed us a Jedi projecting himself across interstellar distances in the form of a projection, which makes it feasible the Sith can occupy or dominate a clone across the same distances. The Emperor, who was thrown down the shaft in the Return of the Jedi, was a clone. The one that battled Yoda in the Senate was the same clone. Snoke was a new clone because everyone believed the Emperor dead. This enabled Palpatine to rule his fleet while still having the galaxy believe he was dead. Yeah, you know what? That's actually not a bad theory. Until we're told differently, I can kind of go with that. I can make that headcanon for a bit. Lucas gave us a clue to the dark side years ago, and JJ and the writing team picked up on it. Once you start down the dark path forever, will it dominate your destiny? And the one he's referring to is how many of the Sith apprentices seem to have at least a degree of domination inflicted upon them through their personal flaws. Dooku seems to be smart to have wholeheartedly embraced the dark side. It seems more likely he had doubts about the Jedi and considered the dark side, thus opening himself up to persuasion, if not domination. Anakin seems to submit to the dark side after a similar doubt and almost dominated when he kneels. This spell or domination appears to break when his son was being tortured, almost like a spell being broken. Shlomo then writes, "Wow, that was really good. I'm going to start my own clickbait Star Wars channel now." Cordially, Shlomo 0. Ha, that's pretty funny. All right. Got a couple of more here. Let's see. Friend of the show, Edwin, says this. Hello, John. I just heard about the High Republic for Star Wars, and it made me think about EMBARK. Cool. I didn't read much Star Wars novels, but it looks like I need to sign up for the audio. Great show, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you, Edwin. I really appreciate that. All right. So one more comment this week, and we're going to wrap things up. And I really, really love this comment. I may actually talk a little bit about this on the main show this week as well. But Claire writes this. First of all, John, I just want to say I love your podcast. Thank you, Claire. And I don't like your comments just because you buttered me up at the beginning, but I do appreciate it. I'd like to pick up on something that you spoke about in your latest listener feedback episode. I've seen a number of people take issue with Rey's response to Ben Solo's death, and I would like to offer my reading of the final scene of The Rise of Skywalker. I do agree the ending is ambiguous, so I understand why people have complaints. However, the moment that really moved me was when Rey places the two lightsabers on either side of that piece of cloth, then rolls them toward one another and ties them together. To me, this act symbolizes the coming together of both Luke and Leia in the Force, but also the coupling of Rey and Ben. These are the sabers that they used to stand against Palpatine. They are united as a dyad in the Force, the two that are one. The last scene isn't overly triumphant, but it is rather bittersweet. It portrays pilgrimage and ritual, with Rey paying her respects to those who have helped her on her journey. And then that final image of the rising twin suns, the rise of Skywalker personified in Rey, made possible because Ben, the last Skywalker, gave his life to revive her, and now his spirit lives in her too. Sorry for the long email. No, Claire, thank you very much. But I wanted to express the significance of the film's ending. I understand why it doesn't resonate with everyone, but it did with me. Again, thanks for the great content you provide. Best wishes, Claire. The ending resonated with me too, and I really, really like the way that you described it and your view on how that went down. I hadn't looked at it that way. I guess I kind of had looked at it that way, but I hadn't really gone that deep into it. But I do like what you've put together here. And again, I mean, without a further explanation, which we probably won't ever get, I can absolutely make that my headcanon. I'll talk more about this on the main show this week. Again, we got a lot of stuff to get to with the High Republic stuff. I really can't wait to give you my thoughts on that. I'm cautiously optimistic on the High Republic, and I'm going to give it a lot of leeway because it is just a publishing endeavor. But when it comes to the Rise of Skywalker, and I've mentioned this many times, but I'm coming to the realization that the Rise of Skywalker for me is one of those rare occurrences where a movie just really, really grabbed me. Almost in a way The Last Jedi didn't. I love The Last Jedi. I've said it before. I'll say it again. I think it's a masterpiece. But there is just something about when you watch any movie, and I'm not just talking about Star Wars. It's weird. I'm having a moment with The Rise of Skywalker where it almost transcends even my Star Wars fandom into something different. I love it as a Star Wars movie, but as a movie in and of itself, I'm just really finding myself drawn to it like you get drawn to your favorite films in any genre, even if it wasn't Star Wars. And I'll be honest, Claire, your breakdown of the ending has made an ending that I already thought was beautiful and done splendidly and added even more emotional depth to it. So I really do. I appreciate everybody's comments, but Claire, thanks for sharing yours on the Rise of Skywalker, because this is a movie that is becoming incredibly special for me as a fan of Star Wars and a fan of movies in general. All right, that's it for listener feedback this week. Thank you so much for checking out the show. If you want to support My Nerd World and all that I do here on My Nerd World, the best way to do that is go out and pick up a copy for you or a friend of my science fiction space opera series, EMBARK. About 5 years ago, I set out on this journey to see if I could do what I thought would be the hardest thing for me to do in creating something, and that is write a novel. I am I am horrible with the English language. That's why I'm a talk show host. I speak it okay. I've made a living doing that. But in terms of writing and grammar, I'm atrocious at it. And I really wanted to challenge myself. And I was inspired by George Lucas. I was inspired by Ernie Klein, who wrote Ready Player One, which I was reading at the time when I was working on the details of the story. The science fiction stories that I love beyond Star Wars, the 90s teen romances and the late 80s teen romances. I was inspired by all these things, and I wanted to create my own universe and my own space opera, and that's what EMBARK became. I had this idea to take the concept of sort of Fast and Furious and sort of expand upon it. A group of friends who have, instead of cars that they can customize, they have flying vehicles they can customize, because air and space flight has taken over car culture on Earth in way off in the future. And so now people don't drive cars anymore. They fly around in vehicles that can go in space in an atmosphere with the same level of instruction needed to go and drive a car. Through that, I created a character, Taft Guardia, who is our protagonist, who is in love with a girl, as boys tend to be. And they're both thrust into the middle of this mystery, while on the global stage, Earth begins to face a massive industrial apocalypse. And there's a corporate madman who has covertly built a military force that attempts to go and exploit the disaster as humanity escapes and evacuates to the stars. That's the setup for EMBARK, and it just grows from there in Treasure in Darkness, and then comes to a climactic conclusion in The Vanishing War, which will come out in April. More stories are being written. I have a spin-off story, which will be book number 4, that'll take place between The Vanishing War and the main saga stories, which will be book number 5. I've already begun working on book 4. It's written in first person, where my stories right now are written in a third-person omniscient view to kind of give you that big storytelling and to make it feel like a movie. So if you want to support the show, please go to Amazon.com right now and search for Jon Justice and EMBARK. You can get the ebook, the paperback, and the audiobook for book 1 and 2 right now. $2.99, $12.99, and $11.99 respectively for EMBARK and Treasure in Darkness. And then the audiobook, which you can get at a massively discounted price if you purchase the ebook for $2.99. And if you've already purchased it, please go and leave a positive review. But if you still want to support the show, gift it to a friend that you know likes to read and likes sci-fi. You can do that right there on the Amazon homepage. All right, that's it for this week's listener feedback. In the next day or so, we will have the next Star Wars podcast here from My Nerd World. And again, we're going to get into Bob Iger. We're going to get into the High Republic. We're going to get into some comments made by Pablo Hidalgo about the ending of The Rise of Skywalker. And I'll also wrap up my sort of scene-by-scene breakdown of The Rise of Skywalker like I did last week. So thank you so much for checking out this show. Go pick up a copy of either book of EMBARK or both. It would mean the world to me. And email me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or leave a comment on YouTube.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.